Good morning, everyone. So for the last 3 days, I was out of town up in Detroit visiting one of our seminaries. I had lots of meetings with faculty, meetings individually with our seminarians, and overall had to make sure that our future priests are getting formed properly for a life of service in the church. One of the other things, though, that was going on at the seminary when I was visiting is that there were a lot of visitors. It was kind of a come-and-see weekend. Lots of men in their 20s who were also thinking about the priesthood, coming to see what it was like to live in the seminary. So in the evening, there was this big social event going on. Everyone was dressed casually. I was not dressed as a priest. One of the students who didn't know me came up and asked, "Are you thinking about becoming a priest?" I said, "I've given it a thought or two." Every time I go back to the seminary, which is more and more frequent now, and I see all these young guys who are in the same position that I was just a few years ago, I'm confronted with the reason why I became a priest in the first place. Over time, that starts to get blurry, and you have to go back to it. Why did I choose this vocation to celibacy and service in the life of the church? Was it to keep buildings from falling down? Was it to raise money to build new things? Was it to keep a business in good shape? No, that's not why I became a priest. I became a priest because I desired connection with God. I desired to give myself wholeheartedly to the Lord's service, and I desired to be drawn upward, not downward. I imagine if I asked for those of you who are married, why did you get married? Your answers might be similar. Why did you get married in the first place? Was it because you were looking forward to rowdy children? Was it because you wanted to say goodbye to a good night's sleep? Was it because you couldn't wait to be irritated by your spouse? No, I would venture to guess that's not why you got married. You probably got married because you wanted connection to your spouse. You wanted to pour your heart out for them so they could pour their heart out to you. You wanted to be drawn upward in the relationship rather than downward. But here's the problem. Back to that why question. We don't always ask that why question. Why did I get drawn to this vocation in the first place? We don't bother to go back to that initial fire and enthusiasm that gripped us years ago. Instead, we put up with the drudgery of everyday life. We give in to thinking that daily life will always be sad and depressing. We settle for being drawn downward rather than being drawn upward to God. So how do we get drawn upward to the Lord? This brings us to our gospel today. So Jesus says, "When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw everyone to myself." Is he talking about when he rises from the dead, that he'll draw all of us to himself? Or what about when he ascends into heaven? Is that when he's going to draw us to himself? No, because the very next line, he said this indicating the kind of death he would die. Jesus is talking about that, the cross. That is when he's going to draw everyone to himself. When he is lifted up there, all humanity gets drawn to him. Only from the cross does Jesus draw all people to himself. The greatest humiliation of Jesus is also his glorification. When humankind rejects Jesus on that cross, it amounts to him drawing all of humanity to himself. And here's the paradox, because you and I think that being lifted up, going upward, means having power and influence, having money and possessions, having it all together in life. That's what we think. But the gospel says that a weak God has come to save us. A vulnerable God has come to lift us up. And a suffering God up there draws us to himself. The cross is the most glorious thing done by God. Why? Because any God, think of any potential God out there, any God can overpower you and me, who are mere creatures. But the difference with our God is that he loves us to the point of suffering our abuse and our overpowering of him, so that he submits to being overpowered by human beings up on that cross. That's the Christian difference. That's the difference between our God and everyone else's gods. And here's the point where you and I come in. Jesus says to his disciples, "Whoever serves me must follow me. Not just follow after me, but imitate me." And to imitate Jesus means that you go upward like him, upward to that cross. That means taking up the annoying things that your spouse does. That means living with your children, knowing that they are God's children first. That means, for me, being challenged to serve you in the best way possible. It's about going upward to the cross. Because if we're to follow the example of Jesus, that means the way to power is to give power away. The way to riches is to give riches away. And the way to influence is to not seek influence. Because that's what happened to him up there. And then look at the influence that that brought to us. I like to think of the cross as an image, almost as a ladder. What does a ladder do? It makes you ascend. You're able to be lifted up to places where you cannot reach. And what's the difference that Jesus did for us? It's that he came down from heaven, being up there and not needing us, came down to see the wretchedness that we were in, to become human like us, so as to ascend back up on that cross, so that you and I aren't stuck like schlups down on this earth with no hope, no faith, and no trust. So that now we can ascend up to God on that ladder of the cross. The only way to ascend to heaven is through the cross, because that's the only way that Jesus did it. And we follow after him by being lifted up with him on that cross. Jesus had his own cross, the greatest cross of all. But you and I also have our own crosses. Think of all of those things in your life which are crosses to bear. And when Jesus says, "I will draw all humanity to myself," it means that all of us with the crosses that are on our backs, we get lifted up on that cross with Jesus. Because that's the ladder that lifts us up to heaven. Through the cross is where you experience glory. Because only through the cross, when you give yourself away, when you get down low, then you're able to be lifted up. So back to the question I was confronted with. Are you thinking about becoming a priest? I am. This morning I was confronted with that question today. Am I going to be a priest today? Am I going to be intentional about it? Are you going to be intentional about being married today? And for all of us, are we going to be intentional about being disciples of Jesus today? Because it's only through the cross that we can be lifted upward.